folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name is Dan Lizette, and this is episode 96. Thank you guys very much for coming back. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you have enjoyed a lot of the recent episodes. Last week's conversation was a personal favorite of mine, and I've heard back from a lot of you as well, and I'm glad you enjoyed my conversation with Sophie Harper from Not By Accident, and I hope you've checked it out because it is a great show that I really hope a lot of you take the time to subscribe to and let her know that you're loving the work that she's doing. Speaking of loving work that people do, a couple of weeks ago, back on episode 94, you guys heard from me and my special co-host, Agent Palmer, on that episode on the most recent recommendation show on the Podcast Digest, where we each ran down two of the shows that we loved. And one of those two that I threw out there and talked about, and admittedly I did it on that episode and I'll do it again now, got a little fanboyish over one of my recommendations that I've become a huge fan of. The show is called Myths and Legends, and the host and producer is Jason Weiser, and I'm super excited to be joined by Jason this week on the Podcast Digest. So Jason, welcome.
Hey, Dan.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. And I should mention ahead of time that at the moment of this recording, you did share with me that you'd not heard my fanboying, so I was very excited about that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I don't know if it's like the Midwestern person in me. I get really bashful whenever to talk about myself or to hear, I don't know if it's weird, but like to hear overly positive things or anything like that.
Well, I have a feeling that this may be a difficult conversation for you, but I'm going to do my best.
Yeah.
I'll do my best to try to tone it down ever so slightly. But speaking of talking about yourself, I'm going to ask you to do that just a little bit because I would like folks to get to know a little bit about Jason way before Myths and Legends. If you could tell folks a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so let's see. I grew up in Ohio, and I have really always loved these stories that I tell. I was 7 years old, and I got a massive volume of Greek mythology and way too young to be reading that sort of stuff. But I loved it. I dug into it. And in college, I was an English major. And then after college, I graduated college in probably 2009. And right in the middle of right at the start of actually the recession. And I knew I was never going to do anything with English. I loved it, but never going to do anything with English. So I got a job in medical research and like biobehavioral research, psych research, stuff like that. And I worked in that for about 5 years. And so the podcast really came out of like me needing some sort of creative outlet in that environment, because I was doing a lot of like academic writing and just a lot of. It was okay, but it was just sort of boring day in, day out stuff. And I was looking at grad schools and stuff like that. And so I just started the podcast because I really wanted an excuse to get into these stories again and like tell these stories and have an excuse to kind of just really research them and really know them, because, I've just loved them my whole life.
So then Myths and Legends was born. For anyone, and folks, if you didn't pick it up back from episode 94, I'm giving you a second chance to do it. But if by some odd chance, Jason, there's a couple of people listening to this for the first time and didn't get my full-throated recommendation a few weeks back, tell folks just kind of the 35,000-foot view. What is Myths and Legends in your own words?
Yeah, so Myths and Legends is sort of just me telling stories from folklore. So like Aladdin, King Arthur, Greek mythology like Theseus and Hercules and things like that. But sort of I was really surprised that nobody, like a lot of the adaptations weren't the real story behind the story, but like weren't the real story that was told, thousands of years ago, but like sort of like a processed, sanitized version of it. So I really, and like, because I've grown up with these stories and I was an English major, I knew these amazing stories existed in these old books, and I just wanted to bring them out. So I basically every week I tell stories from folklore, and it started out sort of being playful with it in the beginning, but it's not sort of just kind of, I'm not reading the stories from the books. I take in a bunch of different sources and I kind of make it into one narrative.
So let's go back in time, right to this time when you have this idea. What I'm really curious about is you notice there are little to no other podcasts, especially at least at that time, that are doing this type of thing. What's the thought process like, kind of, especially creatively? How do you go about sort of piecing this thing together in the early days?
Yeah, so I actually came up with this. I started the podcast in what was it, April of 2015. I recorded the first episode in December of 2014, and I sat on it for like 6 months. But I actually had the idea in like 2011, and I just like sat on it for years because I was so nervous of getting on mic and like putting myself out there and talking and stuff like that. So, but in like, let's see, in December, I don't know, it just sounded fun. And the process, let's see. So that's actually a good thing. I was going to be the mythology podcast because I just wanted to focus on mythology, but then like I started like really getting into mythology. I started at the very beginning, and it starts out with, rape, castration, incest. It's just so dark. And I just like, do I want to put my name out there? Do I want to be out there every week telling these, frankly, kind of horrific stories? Like I've talked about them on the podcast in time, but I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know about this. So I retooled it and I changed it into Myths and Legends, and I was going to focus more on legends. But I actually already bought the domain name Myth Podcast. So that's actually why I have the incredibly boring name of the Myths and Legends Podcast. I wanted something cool and catchy, but I couldn't justify spending another like $100-something on a new domain and hosting package.
That happens to a lot of us, I imagine. I've told my crazy story about why my site is .info and not .com, but that's, it happens. In our early days, the things, if we could go back in time. So
yeah.
you mentioned you had a first recording in December, and you didn't actually release to April. So what was that window like? Were you sharing that first recording with a couple close friends or family or something, or were you kind of like just re-recording and what was that time window like?
So I didn't do a thing with it. I recorded 3 episodes actually. The 3 Yvain episodes, the first 3, and like I was like, okay, well, I'll get around to putting it on iTunes and stuff like that, because I knew like once my plan, I had done some research on podcasts and like kind of what makes podcasts successful, and a lot of times people say, a really consistent schedule, and I think that's definitely true, but I knew that once I put it out, it would be live, and I'd have to be going every week. So my plan was to start with like 5 episodes in the bank, but I just never got around to recording those other 2. And then I was like, well, it's, this was a fun idea, but maybe I'll put this off until, I have more time. And then, a couple weeks turned into a month, couple months turned into like 6 months. And I eventually my wife kept saying, well, are you going to do that podcast you've been talking about? So I was like, I'll get to it and stuff like that. But then I was like, you know what? I'll upload it to iTunes, and I'm sure like once, I'll make the feed and all that, but like I'll put it on iTunes. I'm sure like iTunes will give me some sort of confirmation before it goes live, and then I'll be able to just sit on it there a little bit longer. But then like I got a notification. I saw like the first 3 episodes were up, and I was like, all right, looks like I'm doing a weekly podcast.
So, Jason, you had mentioned those early episodes, and what I was curious about was, after you sort of had that period of time where you had kind of, waited a few months and had those 3, and then you popped it live on iTunes. At that point in time, what did you think would come of all this? Did you think it would just be something fun to do? Maybe a few people would like it, or kind of what was level the expectations for me at that point in time?
I mean, I had apps. Think about the lowest expectations, and they were just slightly lower than that. Like, okay, so this is a podcast that I've been looking for a long time, that like I thought would be really interesting, because I listen to a lot of history podcasts, and they would make references to these stories, but no one would ever talk about what the stories were, but at the same time, like, it's one guy talking for like 30 minutes to 45 minutes, straight. I did not have high about like let's be frank, like King Arthur and Vikings and mythology, like kind of nerdy topics. So I had super low expectations for it. And after we ended up moving shortly after I started the podcast, and my plan was to go back to school. And so my whole thing with the podcast was maybe, while I'm working on the podcast, maybe I can like write a fantasy novel, and I can maybe the audience from the podcast will be enough that enough people will buy the book that I can pay for prereqs to go back to school. Like that's how low my expectations were for a podcast. Like not making any money or doing any, it getting out there not at all. So.
Well, obviously it took a much different turn, which we'll cover in depth here in just a minute. But you popped those first 3 out, and what happened? Did you have the experience where the first, couple of days or a week or whatever, it was like 8 people downloaded, or did you start to see some results pretty soon?
No, I did not. I didn't see results. Basically no one listened to it for the first month, and then even for the next 3 months after that, so for the first 4 months, barely anybody listened to it. And yeah, no, it was just silent, which was actually really good, because had it blown up in the beginning, like I don't know how many people have listened to the show, but I make these like kind of super nerdy, nerdy in jokes about like pop culture and stuff like that. And I don't think I would have been super comfortable doing that if like tens of thousands of people were listening. But in my mind, this was never going to happen. So it really gave the show time to kind of find to like find my voice a little bit, and like the show to kind of find what it was going to be about. And so I think that was ultimately a really good thing that I had, 3 months of complete silence.
So I want to ask you about the turning point, but before I do that, during that first 3 months, as you kind of looked back at episode 1, episode 2, and say now you're on 5 or 6, let's say, were you already starting to sort of make changes, kind of, tweak the approach, or did you look back at 1 and 2 and be like, or, kind of, was there an early evolution phase, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing came from me was somewhere between 3 and 4, episodes 3 and 4, I realized, so I had started with the idea of like, just kind of give, not a summary, but like kind of just tell what happens in the original and kind of make fun of it, or kind of like poke fun of it, like, oh, look how ridiculous this is, or like, ha ha ha, Yvain has a lion friend. But I realized that not only would that was just boring for me, but it was like you can only get so much mileage out of that one joke. And like, but at the same time, when I started the Aladdin story, I realized that like there are reasons why these stories have lasted for as long as they have, and they mean something to people, and they're just really good stories, and they're very human stories. So I wanted to kind of tap into that too. Like there's definitely still the kind of poking fun at the ridiculousness of it at times, but I really kind of felt comfortable and felt confident in exploring the kind of nuances of the story, and maybe the reasons why they have stuck around the way they have. So
how long, as you start down this road, you mentioned the first 3 months was kind of the quiet period, if you will. What was it that changed, or are you even 100% aware of sort of what the turning point was?
Yeah, so it grew pretty steadily for the first, let's see, I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I was an English major, so, but like the first 10 months or so, it grew pretty steadily. Like there was no breakout moment until I think February of 2016, when just BuzzFeed randomly mentioned it in an article, and after that it was on. It was insanity. Yeah, no, I was like, oh, I wonder if this will do anything. I remember the day it came out. I was like, oh, I wonder if this will do anything. And then the podcast shot, like the next morning, the podcast was in the top 10 on iTunes, and I could not believe it at all.
Now, at that point, and I don't want to get too far ahead in the story, but what are you doing at that point? Are you still actively working at that point? Because if I understand correctly, Myths and Legends is now your full-time deal, yes?
Yes. Well, so I'll back up. I'll go back up. So I was working until, let's see, I was working about a month after the podcast started, we ended up moving to a different city, and I left my job in research, and I've been doing the stay-at-home dad thing for about over a year, and the podcast was really good for keeping me sane there, but it was one of those. It wasn't really going to be something I did because it was a podcast, and so I was looking at like different grad schools and different like finding jobs in Syracuse where we moved. And so it was after kind of February that it started really taking off and ads became a possibility. And so I talked on the show about this will enable me to go full time, and people kind of just jumped to the conclusion that I was now full time, which technically I've been full time for 10 months, but it's basically I've been like full-time stay-at-home dad and a full-time podcaster, but now I just don't need to kind of think about my next step in life right now. Am I going back to school? Do I need to find a different job? It's like the podcast can actually have a future, which is a little mind-blowing.
It's got a full-time revenue associated with its full-time labor now. So.
Yes.
Okay, so let's jump in a little bit on content and production, because first of all, you mentioned that ever since you were young, you were a voracious reader of these type of stories. But beyond that, as you've been now, I think as we sit here and record, and as most people are listening, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I've been trying to kind of parse this. You are somewhere in the neighborhood of 55, 56 actual episodes, and several of them have plenty of parts. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, 56 actual episodes. When you're starting a podcast, really think about how you number things because it'll stick. So I have this weird system where I number it based on story. So like the first story went 3 parts, and it's 1A, 1B, 1C. So I've done 36 stories, but I've done 56 episodes. It's
So at some point, I'm guessing X number after launch, you had to start sort of actively researching and finding things. So where do you go to find this? Are these internet searches, library tours, kind of how do you start to decide which one you're going to attack as your next episode?
That's a really good question. So for the first maybe 10 or 20 episodes, I didn't start the podcast without having a list of potential topics, because I didn't want to get like 7 episodes in and just, well, that's it for the Myths and Legends podcast, because I can't think of anything else to do. So I like, from the English major and stuff like that, I kind of knew what I was going to do for the first little bit. But so yeah, that's a really good question. I look all over the place. I do a lot of different research. Really it's just reading a lot of stories, and honestly, like, most of them don't pan out. It's not that they're not good stories, but it's just, I'm kind of looking for something. Well, I'm just looking for really, really great stories to tell. And, sometimes it's easy with like the Greek mythology and Theseus and all that. But really it's just looking all over the place, casting a wide net, and whatever I find, that's it. But I really look for stuff that surprises me too. Like, after all this time, if I find myself like getting chills or like gasping at like something that happened, something that was written in the 1600s, right, like that's a good story. So that's something that goes in there. But I don't really have a good answer to that, because I kind of just look all over the place.
So you mentioned that not all of them, not all that you read or research, mm-hmm, ends up turning into episodes, and that kind of leads me into the next thing I wanted to talk about. I'm thinking about some podcasters I would put in sort of a similar family, if you will. The one that comes to mind, and I imagine most people have drawn a parallel. You've probably heard it already, and he's actually one I talk to on a regular basis online, which is Aaron Mahnke from Lore. And I know Aaron's process is a lot of research, but then before he records, he's actually writing out, if you will, full-blown scripts of what's happening. I'm guessing your process is similar?
Oh my goodness, yes. I write out, I script everything, absolutely everything. I don't think I'm very good on the mic. I did a test recording of the first episode where I just kind of outlined it or bullet pointed it, and it didn't sound good at all. So I need the full script.
And your episodes, like you mentioned earlier, right around that 30-minute mark, give or take, depending on the episode. What are we talking?
They've been creepy.
Yeah, what are we talking in terms of length here? What is this manuscript you've created each week?
Oh my goodness. So the first ones were great because they were only like 15 minutes long, but like the most recent episode I did, I think it was Pocahontas. It was the first Pocahontas episode, and oh my gosh, it was like 8,000 words. Jeez. And that has kind of become the more the norm than the exception. That used to be the exception where, if I had one where I really wanted to finish it up on a certain story, like there wasn't enough to stretch to next week, then I would, push it to maybe 6,000 words. But now kind of 6 to 8 has become the norm. I don't know. I guess maybe I talk fast. I've heard that from people, but
so kind of not necessarily exact numbers unless you could put some to it, but even maybe as a percentage between research, writing, and recording / production, if you will, kind of where does the bulk of the work lie, and or what is maybe the section that you find to be more time consuming and more difficult? Talk to us about this full length workflow.
Yeah, my workflow. So the workflow is, ideally I am working on 3 episodes at once. Like I am editing the recording and finding music for one, or recording, editing, and finding music, and then for the one that comes out, next week, then for the week after, I'm writing that one, and for the week after that, I'm reading and researching sources for the next topic. That doesn't always happen because sometimes you just get behind, but yeah, the writing comes pretty easily to me, and I've always, like I said, I really like the reading part. Honestly, for me, my Achilles heel, I guess, to use it overly appropriate.
I was going to point that out. Great reference there.
Yeah. Wait. But my Achilles heel has always been the recording and the editing. Oh, that's just it's like I said, the writing comes easy, but the editing just gives me the most headache. And like it shouldn't, because it's all scripted. But I'm not, like I said, I don't. Reading from a script on tape is it's surprisingly tough. That's one of the first things I figured out, that it's really hard to do that and sound natural. So,
see, I got to jump in here, Jason. I would argue you've pulled that off to a degree that I don't think many others have. I mean, I think it's clear that it's a script, which is why I mentioned it earlier, but that assures a flow and consistency that I think comes across splendidly. And look, I've been one, and many of these people listening have probably either thought it themselves, or many of people listening have been on the show and told me this. And I'm kind of like you. People tell me all the time about my voice, and I hate it because they're way too over complimentary. Yeah. But seriously, I think you've got a spectacular narration voice, and it's a fit for storytelling. And it's not radio announcer like people have told me mine, but you have a perfect storytelling kind of tone and pacing that I think is so appropriate for the stories now.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's something I've really, 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 really worked on over the course of the podcast, and that's why so much editing goes into this whole thing. But thank you so much. Yeah, and you do have a really good radio voice, by the way. That's what I noticed.
And I didn't bring that up for that. And I want to talk about editing and music and things like that. But first, I want to go back to the writing, because the best thing, and I mentioned this on my recommendation episode a few weeks ago, you said this a few minutes back as well, that you don't just read a story. And I want folks to be clear on this. Jason's not opening a book or going to a website and reading you some old story. No. That is not even remotely close to what you get with Myths and Legends. Rather, you are authoring this script, and yet you have a tone of voice that I think creates an approachability. Anybody who's hearing things like this, and I said this in my review, and I'll admit this to you, this topic matter, I personally didn't kind of grow up or personally have a passion for it. However, the way that you've modernized it, and I know your website talks about modern storytelling, the way the asides you pull aside, the almost comedic commentary, you personalize and humanize and modernize this story in a way that's completely approachable. I'd love to hear more about sort of what the thought process was in putting this together in this way.
Yeah, so First off, I wish I was just reading reading an old story and put up there. No, that's
be a lot easier, right?
But yeah, no. But no. So my thought process was that, and this is actually something I worried about in the beginning, where I was like, well, somebody could just, they could. I hear Audible all the time. They could, just do an Audible, subscription and, listen to the audiobook. Like, why listen to me? But there's something I was really going for in that. I listened to podcasts while I was doing other things, and I like I said, I listen to a bunch of history podcasts, and it's really hard to keep track of a lot of different details and a lot of different names and a lot of different things when you're doing other things. And so I really kind of wanted to have that sort of, like, I was sitting down telling the person about it, but not be, sometimes I go into describing a scene or something like that, but I try to keep that, only kind of as high points or only sort of as like accents, because audiobooks are good, but if I'm washing the dishes, it's kind of hard to focus on audiobooks, or if I'm like driving, it's so I really wanted to kind of have that really make it conversational, because like these stories, these are, like I said, they're really great stories, and I don't know, the original texts don't really lend themselves to that. So,
and you've gone, go even deeper for me, if you will, Jason, because you didn't go to the point of adding voices, and I don't mean voice impressions, but almost it's as if this person said, or go so far as to, I want to pause this right here and just tell you this, and I think those are what it makes this so much better than an audiobook. And do you ever kind of worry about doing that, or was that sort of, this is my hook thought process?
So that's a good question. That's something I think about from time to time, and I'm not sure. I think coming into the podcast, my listeners you can kind of understand what is, what's me and what's the story. So like, I do kind of add in, dialogue of like, to kind of like clarify the scene a little bit more and kind of, break things up. But I don't think it's like, hopefully people know it. I think people know that it's coming from me. Like tonally, it's just completely different from, Merlin did this, and then King Arthur was like, "Hey guys, what do you like?" So I think that the distinction is pretty clear. It's something that I think about from time to time, but at this point, like I said, that was one of those things that I sort of developed early on. That if the podcast had this big light shined on it immediately, it probably would have withered and died. But it's something that is sort of become part of the show, and it's something I really enjoy. And
it's interesting because it's almost like you have found the ability, or maybe you've just been able to write into the script your reaction as you're reading it, which then kind of pops a relationship with the listener, because you're almost verbalizing what they may have just thought at this ridiculous thing that you just told in the story.
Yes.
And I think it's awesome. Like I'm looking at the website now, and one of the more recent episodes, which I thoroughly enjoyed, real episode number 52, you will, story 32, the Trickster's Wagers. This was the one on the race, right? I hope I've got. And it's so funny because you're like, the tortoise is just saying, well, you go ahead, and I'll see you there. And it's you're bringing this, like, almost a visual to the listener, which there's not a lot of any format podcast where people are delivering basically a visual, and that's it's what people were thinking if they would read this story, and you're bringing it all out. I think it's just a phenomenal way of going about doing what you're doing.
Well, thanks. I think I don't know. I think the dialogue and stuff like that really, and the asides really go a long way to communicate the story, even more so than just telling the story. But yeah, no, with the reactions, it's really interesting. It actually came from a professor I had in college who would say things like, the one that comes to mind is like, but he would say things where, he would have these very real reactions, but he's like the professor and he's supposed to be very serious and stuff like this. But it just really helped you kind of relax and understand and get into the story and stuff like that. So it's something that, and it was obvious that he really loved the stories. I mean, he devoted his life to studying them, but at the same time, he could kind of have fun with them. So that's sort of the kind of area, the kind of angle I wanted to take with it.
One more question for you on the content side of things, Jason. You mentioned this early on as well, and I know that you've occasionally some of these episodes will take that darker tone, and I know you've started to sort of mention that up front and sort of include a lot of supporting information on the website sort of along that vein. Talk a little bit about sort of that initial thought, which you described earlier, which is you didn't want this to just be this like wildly depressing, dark thing. But yet, as you're now 56 episodes in, that you have started to touch on a little bit of it, but kind of making sure that it comes across correctly. Sort of what was that thought process?
Yeah, so I really want to kind of like look at the full scale. Like, it's not a horror podcast, but it's like I like the kind of different elements of horror from time to time. There was one about a Korean fox demon that I really enjoyed, and like some of the more serious like Viking episodes aren't really that funny, but they're really good stories. So it's one that I really want to communicate that, but and. Are you asking kind of like about the disclaimers that I put at the front and stuff like that? Or
let me give you sort of where I'm coming from with this.
Yeah, totally.
One thought that could be had, and I think you have any number of episodes where this is completely true. This would be a great podcast for a parent to stick in their kids' ears as almost a bedtime story sort of approach. But obviously, there are any number of episodes where nobody would recommend that, right? Did you even realize at one point that sort of that former thing I mentioned? And if so, were there any concerns with kind of stepping over the line to the latter side?
That's a really good question. So in the beginning, this was never meant, and not that there's anything bad, but it was like this was meant for adults. Right. Like, not that there's anything necessarily explicit in it. I don't really cuss at all. But it was definitely geared towards adults and like the kind of real gritty story, not necessarily gritty, but a lot of them end up being gritty. Stories behind legends and fairy tales. But then I started getting a lot of emails from parents and from teachers and from like junior high and high school classes and like people who like listen to it with their 7-year-old. Right. And so, which is cool because like, these people, this is world literature, and it's like, it's amazing that I can be communicating this, how awesome these things are, and like it informs cultures throughout history and stuff like that. So it's awesome, but at the same time, like I don't know what is appropriate for children, so I kind of maybe I'm a little overzealous in my disclaimers and stuff like that. But I've gotten a lot of positive feedback about that, and it's one of those like once I kind of realized that this wasn't just adults or like just 20 something or whatever, it was. There's a wide range of people listening to it that I really wanted to, I still wanted to cover the topics, but I kind of wanted to, make sure that people knew what it was going to be.
Yeah, and that's why my initial statement was sort of, I think a majority of them are fine. Now, 5-year-olds, okay, but I guess I'm more referring to sort of that, call it that, PG-13 crowd, if you will.
Yes.
By and large, and you might have one or two that you might even throw outside that parameter, but by and large, almost all the episodes would fit in there. And that is not an age group, let's call it, 10 to 15, that typically would jump into this material because it's something they had to do in English class and so on and so forth. But through everything we've been describing, this makes this approachable in a way that I think a book doesn't, research in the library or online doesn't, and you've kind of packaged this all up, and I think that's why you're getting all the feedback you are from those groups.
Yeah, it's really cool. I get letters from emails from high school students who were like, "Yeah, my teacher played this in English class, and I ended up listening to the entire catalog. Great job!" Like, it's really cool.
I would say that's got to warm the heart, right?
It does. It really does.
Especially with an English background like you have,
Well, right, because, I love it, but I constantly got the, whatever, English, what are you going to do with that? That sort of thing.
Right. let's jump into some of the more technical pieces because there's so many good things over there I want to talk about. One is, and I mentioned this again on my recommendation episode, so I wanted to talk to you about it. This is exactly the parallel I gave after this conversation, Jason. You don't even need to listen to it now because I'm pretty much repeating everything I've said. But in there, I drew this parallel between myths and legends and this phenomenon. I told my co-host, I said, do you ever watch a movie or a TV show and, Daredevil season 1 and 2 had infamous fight scenes, and the appearance given in it is that it looks like it's all one take. You see a scene in a movie where it looks like this whole thing was done in one take. I said, that's kind of the impression you get when you listen to Myths and Legends, because you flow from like beat one through the conclusion in a way that just makes it sound like a one take action shot scene, if you will, in a movie. And it's awesome. Talk to me about the editing process to create that illusion, because obviously this isn't one take.
It's such an illusion. Yeah. No, it's definitely not one take. I mess up so much when I record and I read, and if you heard it, like, it would just be frustrating. It's frustrating for me to do it. It'd be so frustrating to listen to, just like even just basic things when I'm kind of thinking about how I'm going to say it as I'm saying it and then just flub it. But yeah, no, it requires a lot of editing. Like, so much editing. So episodes now are taking me about an hour and 20 minutes to record, and then depending on how I do it, it can take anywhere from like 1 to 3 hours just to edit it all together. It's a lot of work. Yeah,
and that's an improvement over, say, a year ago, I would assume.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it used to take me days. Like for the first couple episodes. Granted, I was doing it around a work schedule, but it used to take me days to edit an episode. Yeah, it's editing, like I said, is the roughest part. And then you'll be listening to it. Like, so I record, and I've actually, since we moved, I'm able to have an actual room to record. I've gone through so many stages. I started out recording in my car surrounded by coats, and just to kind of like control for the echo and sound. We lived like a mile from an airport. So, which is
in a car with coats. That's the first, Jason. I'm 96 episodes on this thing. I've never heard somebody say in a car with coats. That's a good idea.
It's
people probably think you're a homeless person that's invaded this resident's car. You're like,
no, I was in my garage, okay. But then I started getting panicked emails from listeners who like listen to the old episodes but haven't really caught up to the new ones. They're like, "Don't run the car in the garage, man. It's not like, you shouldn't do it that way." And I'm like, "No, I wasn't running the car. It was off. I was cold, but it was okay."
Wow.
But yeah, no, and then I was able to, like, with the members, like with the listener support and stuff like that, I was able to get a better mic and move inside. So that's kind of helped. That's helped out a lot, because like, so I'll record and then I'll edit, and that, like I said, that can take up to like 3 hours. And then, I'll put music to it, and then I'll do like a last listen, because my worst fear is that like a sneeze or something comes through, or like one of my mistakes goes through. And then, it's really nice to be able to record at my desk after doing the last listen, because that way I can just fix it right there instead of being like, all right, got to grab my computer, go down to the car, get the codes. Like,
so as a solo podcaster with a fairly involved production process, who has openly admitted not a huge fan of their own voice, there are a lot of people out there who say the same. They don't like their own voice. You've obviously come to grips with it over time.
Yes. I mean, you have to.
Because you hear yourself, right? Constantly, I imagine.
Yeah. Oh, constantly, yeah. But like, basically after an episode is out, after I've done that, after I've obsessed about every little pause in the episode, after it's out, then I don't listen to it again.
Right.
Because I can't.
Had enough at that point.
Yeah.
You mentioned it a minute ago, and I want to dive much deeper.
Yeah.
On the music. It is a central component of Myths and Legend, much more than most other shows I talk to. Talk about that decision, how you go about choosing music, just your whole music process.
Yeah, so that's something that was like something I really wanted to do from the beginning, because I thought it'd be, especially for a storytelling podcast, it really helps to set the tone, and it, like, the emotion and stuff like that. but I really wanted it to be good. I did not. So the first episode has sound effects, and I quickly cut that because I felt like that would be too radio drama. Not even like, just kind of really cheesy if it's just me. But yeah, the music is really good because I up until recently, I've only used Creative Commons music, and it's all been free on the internet that people put out there to use. So it kind of really fits in with the whole podcasting scene. But yeah, in the beginning, I had all the music categorized based on like kind of the first impression emotion it kind of made me think of. So that's kind of how I went from there. And then I was listening, I was like, this really, like, you know, I really spend a long time on the music because it's something that if it's right, if it's good, it works really well. But if it's not, like, it can really kind of leave a bad taste in your mouth and kind of tank the whole show.
Did you find that element difficult at all? Because unless I'm missing something, you didn't really come from a musical background, yes?
Right. No, but like, yeah, no, not at all. And I don't make music or anything like that. But I guess kind of everybody has, if you really sit down and think about like what this music makes you think about or what this music makes you feel, then you can kind of, that's kind of how I used it. Like, yeah, like I don't have a musical background, but I kind of let that inform where I put it in the story and stuff like that.
And now, do you feel now all these episodes in, kind of you more have an ear for the stories, kind of a better idea of where things go?
Yeah, definitely. Or like I'll be writing the story. I'll know where the music breaks will belong, and I'll be like, okay, I really want something that sounds like, sounds solemn here or something like. So yeah, I kind of know what beats I want to hit now that I kind of had to learn.
Another technical aspect I really wanted to ask you about, and we chatted briefly about this in the pre-show. I'm going to start using that term, folks. I don't think I've ever used the term pre-show. I'm now going to do that. A lot of other shows use that. I like it. And I was surprised to hear it soars, but between the website and the album art and the iTunes banner when you'd been featured in the store, I noticed the artwork is amazing. And how do you get a hold of this artwork, Jason?
Oh, well, me and my wife make it. So we know enough about Photoshop and Illustrator to get into trouble, and there are like several like different resources out there for like different things that you can use, and we pay for those and all that, but we kind of. Yeah, it's kind of all these different things, and we put those together every week.
What kind of time are we talking about? It seems some of these have got to be pretty involved, yes?
Oh yeah. Well, so to me, it's kind of like that's kind of like therapeutic. After I've been doing all this like listening and reading and writing, sort of just to work with pictures and colors, like it's amazing. Like, it's so nice. But yeah, no, it was definitely an added thing. It was definitely an added to time each week, but I think it really goes a long way, especially for kind of grabbing people's attention and stuff like that. And it's just kind of fun to do. I don't know.
I could be wrong here, and I'm going to kind of segue in here into the membership component of the show. But before I do that, maybe this goes into it or not, and I'm trolling the website here and I'm not seeing it, but please, if you haven't thought about it yet, I'm sure people have been banging down the door. Some of this artwork looks like it would just be ripe for merchandise.
Yeah, we're working on merchandise. Yeah, definitely.
People have been asking though.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They have, and it's something that's definitely a priority. So we're working on that, but it's one of those with the production schedule and everything. It kind of need to fit it in where I can.
Yeah.
So.
One more thing. I have zero reason to even say this other than the style seems like it would be perfect home over on Cotton Bureau. For what it's worth. Not sure if you're familiar with that website, Cotton Bureau. Yeah, and you can use your own art. Actually, the friend of the show, if you will, I'm a big tech fan, podcast listener, ATP, Accidental Tech Podcast. I've had 2 of the 3 hosts on there, and they just finished a round of T-shirts, and they use Cotton Bureau. And I actually have another shirt from Cotton Bureau, and I just see Myths and Legends artwork fitting in with what Cotton Bureau does. So for what it's worth, no endorsement. I get nothing from saying that. It's the first thing that popped in my head when I thought about merchandise in your show. But
cool, yeah, look into it.
Okay, let's jump in on one of the unique angles of the show, and this has been a constant conversation topic here on the Podcast Digest, because I've recently, 4 months ago or so, attempting things like Patreon, as many others are. You've seen things like Kickstarter. There are shows that have subscriptions. There are things out there like, what is Earwolf doing with Mark Maron? Howl. Howl.fm, and so many other things. Monetization's a big deal. You have a membership component to the show. Tell folks about that, and sort of, before you kind of run it down, what was the thought process behind it, and like, so when did you reach that crossroads where you thought this might be something realistic?
Yeah, so I reached the crossroads. Let me see. I'm looking at an episode list. I reached the crossroads about 20 episodes in, when this was starting to kind of take a lot more time, and I really sort of needed to justify that time. And yeah, it was one of those, like, listenership was good and everything like that, and people were getting back to me, but it's one of those things, like, either I need to, I'm spending way too much time on this, and I need to, well, yeah, like I said, I need to justify it. But one of the things, I started out with Patreon, actually. I spent about a month on Patreon, and then I reached out to another podcaster, Jamie, on the British History Podcast, and he's been doing a membership thing for years, and it just seemed basically like Patreon, but you weren't really locked into the Patreon system. Right. So it takes more work to get off the ground, because you have to make a feed and find a way to password protect it and do the membership thing on your site and have all that work seamlessly, which was a ton of work. But at the end of it, then I have my, like, I can communicate, like, I have my member list, and like they're all members through my website, not through Patreon. So I'm not locked into any external system, which I thought was really nice. And it like saves me like 5% or something like that, whatever, which wasn't a big deal. But that was the main reason that I did the membership thing. And it was one of those, like, I had some people reach out asking to support the show monetarily. So I figured if a few people want to, that'd be amazing. It'll help cover cost of books, and maybe help justify all the time. But that was sort of the main reason I went with the membership thing over Patreon. I actually still have a Patreon page for people who, and I still have a couple people on there, but it's mainly the membership thing now.
So a little geeky nerdy, but I've heard of this before, and again on my Tech Fan podcast listening, Relay.fm is a big tech podcasting network, and they recently launched a membership site, and they are backing the whole thing with Memberful. Is that what this is based on as well?
No, this is I don't know what that is. This is cobbled together from like WordPress. I use a membership plugin with Stripe, and it goes with Blueberry that password protects it.
So you've literally built this yourself, more or less.
Yes, gotcha. Yeah. With some help from like I said, Jamie from the British History Podcast. But yeah, it's I think that's amazing. That's awesome. It's a ton of work though.
Right.
And like when the site goes down, which like I had my feed stupidly configured so that it like made a dynamic page or something like that whenever someone accessed the feed, so which wasn't a problem when no one was listening. But as soon as the February happened, my whole site went down for like 2 days, and no one could subscribe, no one could become a member and stuff like that. And all the members were like, hey, I can't access the feed. So there's a trade-off with that, though, because you do have control, but also you're kind of responsible for all the different areas that can go wrong.
Well, for what it's worth, folks listening, if you're a podcaster and you are interested, I have heard Memberful is a way of doing it, maybe without some of the manual effort. I just went to their website, and it's obviously something you'd have to pay for, but it does have WordPress plugins. It looks like it just drops right into your site, and they kind of manage everything on the back end. So, two ways of going about doing it. You could always reach out to Jason too.
Well, you're gonna regardless, you're gonna need to pay for it if you want something that works.
Right.
So yeah,
absolutely. So what do members get?
Members get So it was originally kind of based on the Patreon thing where it was sort of just kind of bonus episodes. Right now it's a monthly episode that was originally going to be like 8 to 15 minutes long, just something a little extra, but it's ended up being kind of like full episodes recently, which is cool. And I try to do also like little history episodes and culture episodes, as well as if I talk about something in the story, if there's a little side tangent that would completely derail the narrative, but it's kind of interesting, I'll record that and put it up on the member feed too. And also I also do, so a lot of the sources I use have public domain versions, and I go through, I have all those, and I go through and I kind of edit them to kind of help make them a little bit more readable. Work with things like these and thous and stuff like that. And I put that up as an ebook and PDF and stuff like that for people who are really, really interested and really, really want to dive into the sources. So I think I'm gonna add a merchandise component, but that's when I actually have merchandise.
Yeah, I have a feeling I will be lining up for that one. I think I need a Myths and Legends shirt. I really do.
There's a really cool T-shirt that works.
I was gonna say I just want the show logo on that.
Oh, really?
Well, as an original version, just the Myths and Legends, just because I want to wear a shirt that says Myths and Legends.
Nice. Okay. Hey,
and then people say, "What's that?" Then I tell them about your show.
I wonder if people would be interested in a logo. I've always kind of avoided that because I don't know. I guess until like the past 3 years, podcasts have always been kind of this like niche, kind of nerdy thing.
But I guess we're living in a post-serial world, Jason.
Yeah, that's exactly. So it's like part of me was like, would anybody really want to like walk around with a podcast logo on the T-shirt? But I don't know.
Yes, they would. Believe me, there are so many that I'm aware of. The quote unquote the big shows almost always do, and some of those sites like I was describing, Cotton Bureau is one of them, Teespring, so on and so forth. They will show sales numbers up there, and there are shirts being sold from podcasts. Yeah. So that's for sure. So
cool. I'll look into that. I'll see if there might be interest. Yeah. Cool.
Let's see here. What was my next thing? Let's talk about sort of the future. You mentioned a lot of things going on with the membership site. I can imagine all kinds of ideas have run through your head about different things for the future. Anything that maybe you could, share that isn't disclosing anything, maybe just wild and crazy thoughts, maybe someday type thoughts, anything coming up down the road?
Well, I don't know what I can say. Some really cool people have been reaching out and stuff like that. So there might be, it might be other things happening with kind of these stories and stuff like that. But yeah, that's I do have a literary agent now, so we're kind of looking in that direction too. So that would be
well.
Cool,
you mentioned it earlier, and I could easily see sort of, your scripts being converted into, books.
It would be really cool to
And then, like each one's a chapter, the album art is above the chapter number, I mean, it would be gorgeous. I could envision it, but,
Well, thanks. Yeah, it would be something like that would be really cool. So, hopefully something like that's.
I mean,
that's coming up.
For now, it's still going to remain a weekly show. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. There's really no way I can do more than a weekly show. foolishly, I thought that I could start another podcast. And I announced it on the show like a couple months ago that a couple weeks, I'll have another podcast coming out, but it's one of those things I'd really like to do, it's still in the works, but it hasn't happened yet because of the show. But it would be, say, along the same lines as storytelling.
What are your thoughts on the ideas of seasons? Do you anticipate like a summer break at some point and adjusting to a season format? What are your thoughts in general on that?
So I think a season would make sense for me if I did long stories, like longer than I'm doing right now. But honestly, I think this weekly format works so well right now for this show that I wouldn't envision moving to something where it's more separated like that.
Well, that's good to hear. No, I totally understand why so many shows do it.
Oh, yeah.
And I definitely do not begrudge the show that wants a 6-week window to kind of retool and start to put more things in the can, so to speak, before they go again. But I think some shows have kind of left bad tastes in people's mouth about seasons. I'm looking at you, Mystery Show and Invisibilia, that disappear for 8 months or longer, and I think people get disenfranchised with that concept when it's like, this is end of season 1. We'll be back soon with season 2, and 6, 8, 9 months later, it's not returned. I think that is a worry. I think of some podcast listeners.
Well, yeah, especially for like maybe if I was part of like a big network like that where there's something to keep kind of people interested, but like as an independent podcaster, I think it would go away completely. I don't know.
Well, that's a great question. You just walked into that one. Obviously, again, don't disclose anything, but just generally speaking, what are your thoughts on potential network membership someday? I mean, is that something that's completely off the table, or you'll always answer the phone?
I mean, I'll definitely talk to people and stuff like that. So the show is so like it's such a basic show, but it's like very different than a lot of the things that are out there. Like I just don't see myself fitting in super well in a lot of different networks. It's not like there's funny elements, but it's not a comedy show. Right. That's storytelling, but it's not like it's not like Radiotopia storytelling. Right. It's not like NPR storytelling. I would totally entertain it, but it's one of those like it would have to be the right network.
Right. Well, maybe someday you and Aaron can join up because I mean I'm telling you, if you love lore and you don't listen to myths and legends, get on it, and vice versa, really, because I think you two both have completely different styles and obviously different content, but the approach is similar, and if you enjoy one, I'm pretty confident you will enjoy the other, and you're looking at the top of the iTunes heap, if you will, in what you'll get from either one of these shows. So
yeah, I've actually only heard one episode of Lore, but it's I mean, you don't need me to tell you, it's awesome. Yeah. It's really good, but it's I guess it is another one where it's telling.
Yeah, it's you guys approach sort of the idea of what you're creatively putting together in a similar way. The end results I would consider completely different, especially from a content standpoint. But it's unique to see the use of music and the use of script writing and the narration, and it's splendid. There are big time fans, I think, of both of you, and the reason that Aaron has done what he does with Lore, or your membership efforts have been as successful as they've been, is because I think now at this point you two have proven sort of the approach is sort of tried and true at this point, and if you're willing to put in the time, the work, the effort, the writing, the research, that there is something on the other end for you folks.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, one last quick fun question. I want to know about how the segment Creature of the Week came up, because I love it. You get this little 3-4 minute thing at the end, little bits and bob, and it almost is like mythology education.
Yeah. So definitely. That actually came about because I had this friend, a really good friend of mine who I grew up with and ended up, working with and living with, we used to just kind of like, to kill time at the office, we used to just send random Wikipedia pages back and forth about these ridiculous mythological creatures. And then when we were out hanging out with people, we'd be like, "Oh, have you heard about the Barbaganzi? It's, it's a snow," like, people wouldn't believe it. And it was like kind of a really super nerdy conversation starter and stuff like that. And, but yeah, and so that's something I kind of wanted to showcase, kind of apart from the main narrative. And also it kind of like, it ends the episode on a high note. So you can have like all the Vikings dying and their family members dying and people getting trampled by horses. But then you can, maybe end with like a laugh.
I love the idea of it sort of, it almost like folds in on itself, right? Because, and I've noticed this happen on more than one occasion, one of your creature of weeks, then a couple of weeks later in the episode becomes part of the main story, and now you kind of understand it a little bit. You know what I mean? And it sort of kind of keeps folding in on itself. So it's like,
Yeah, mythology.
At this point, if you've blown through the whole back catalog, you know a lot of creatures.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. But the thing is, like, I am not anywhere near the end of those. I have books and books and books of all, like, a bunch of different creatures. And yeah, that's one of the things I worried about in the beginning, that I would run out of the creatures. But
apparently not a concern, right?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of craziness in the world. So.
Well, folks, I could not throw my recommendation again any more higher than what I do for Myths and Legend and the work that Jason is doing. So, Jason, please take as much time as you like. Tell people where they can find out about the show, all the wonderful information you've got on the website, the membership, social media. Hit them with it all.
Yeah, well, there's mythpodcast.com, mythpodcast.com. I only spell it out because my wife said it sounded like I was saying misspodcast.com. But yeah, it's mythpodcast.com. And if you want to find it on iTunes, I made a super simple itunes.mythpodcast.com. If you're looking for more information on memberships, support.mythpodcast.com. So that's where you can find it. I don't think there's really anywhere else.
You're on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. On Twitter at MythPodcast. That unsurprisingly was open everywhere. So I'm at MythPodcast on Twitter and Facebook.com/MythPodcast. So
it's a phenomenal show, folks. And I say this especially because, just to highlight something I said earlier, this subject matter I was not necessarily a big fan of personally, but after having found this show, it is a regular must listen in my queue all the time, and the work Jason does is just puts a wonderful, approachable spin on the stories. So, Jason Weiser, thank you very much for taking the time to join me here this week.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it was great talking to you, and thanks so much for having me on your show and for all the nice words. Like, really.
Well, and I should mention this, because if I didn't, he may come at me. Jason's show was originally pointed out to me by Mike Boudet from Sword and Scale. You guys know that show very well. I've talked about it many times. And literally one night, some February, March, whenever it was, Mike shot me a DM on Twitter and said, "Dude, you got to listen to this show, and the work this guy's doing is amazing." And I have such an appreciation for the work he does with Sword and Scale. When Mike tells me something's awesome, I immediately went and checked it out. And this is kind of my final signature of agreement on what Mike told me. So just a quick shout out and thank you to Mike for exposing me to Jason's awesome work here. So, folks, that will do it for episode 96 of the Podcast Digest. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jason of Myths and Legends. All the links will be in the show notes, as they always are. Until next week, when I'm back again with another great conversation with another show you're sure to love, I will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.